that monograph on Cezanne, which is indeed a very little book. I mean, literally, it's only about that big. You can easily overlook it. You find it in the pile of impulse books in bookstores. You know, if you don't want to spring for the whole catalog, you buy the cheap little book. That is really where this started, in a conscious way. Because what really got me going on Monsieur Pellerin, if I think back, was the Matisse retrospective, which you can blame almost anything for aesthetically, and which I still miss. If I just turn these on, will I get the first two slides? Okay. When I say the Matisse retrospective started this, the painting on the left was one of, for me, the real surprises of the retrospective. It was a painting that I had either ignored or hadn't paid enough attention to or hadn't seen before. And it literally stopped me dead in my tracks every time I went to the show. It is a portrait of Auguste Pellerin, and all it said in the note in the catalog is industrialist and collector. And I was quite intrigued by that. And then when I saw the show, the version of the show that went to Paris, there was the painting on the left, which I was so devoted to, accompanied by the painting on the right. And that surprised me as well, particularly when I discovered that the painting on the left was the first version of the picture, and the painting on the right was, the painting on the right was the first version of the picture, which had been rejected by the sitter. And the painting on the left, which is an infinitely tougher, less ingratiating painting, I think you will agree, was the second version and was accepted by the sitter. Well, that got me interested. And then I promptly forgot about the whole thing. But it all came back to me when I started working on the retrospective, the little monograph, and I started choosing the works to be reproduced in the monograph, which, although it's a little book, has over 200 reproductions. And as I went through the Ventura Catalogue Raisonné, every time I came across a picture that I really wanted to reproduce, at least 3/4 of the time it said, as provenance, collection Auguste Pellerin. And then I remembered these images. So I started doing some digging. Now, reminding you that the first version was the painting on the right, and the second version was the painting on the left, that tells you something about the person who commissioned them. What I think is extremely impressive about the painting on the left is that it's both a kind of emblem of an entire class of affluent men, and it's a particular individual. You'd recognize him if you saw him on the street. The painting on the right, which is, I think, much more overtly pleasant and much more naturalistic, it's a good painting. It's not a great painting. It's much more decorative, it's more seductive, it has more of the emblems of the office. A little younger, a little more relaxed, certainly a less severe characterization. But that was rejected. Now that rejection of a Matisse portrait by the sitter is not unheard of, because this was such a routine thing with Matisse that when he accepted a portrait commission, he customarily gave his sitters the right to refuse the finished picture if they did, without paying. so that when he worked, he would not be inhibited by their desires and attempt to please his sitters. And it was not unheard of for them to take him up on his offer. Now, as I say, what surprised me was this fierce black painting was the one Pellerin preferred. Now, he later is supposed to have decided that he'd been wrong about the first picture and tried to obtain both of them at a discount. Matisse refused and ultimately received his full payment, which was double the original fee for the two canvases. I think Pellerin got a very good deal. But the thing that I keep harping on is the rigor, the toughness, the abstractness of this painting on the left, which is, to me, as implacable as an Egyptian statue. And that's not a casual observation, because I think there may be some connection between the sun disk on certain royal portraits, Egyptian royal portraits, and the way the forehead and cheekbones have been stylized into a kind of disc in this painting. But the toughness of this picture suggests to me that obviously this is no ordinary collector. And clearly, the more I discovered about Pellerin, the more obvious it became that he was no ordinary collector. He was born in Paris in 1852. His fortune came from the manufacture of margarine, of all things, in France, Germany, England, and the Scandinavian countries. His relations with Scandinavia were so close that he served as Consul General for Norway in Paris from 1906 until his death in 1929. His collection apparently began conventionally enough, as befitted a wealthy entrepreneur of his generation, with porcelain, crystal, objets d'art, glass objects, and paintings by such eminently respectable figures as Henner and Caro. But he soon sold his initial acquisitions, including his Caros, to buy Impressionist works. He wasn't alone, of course. Other progressive collectors, admittedly few of them French collectors, were doing more or less the same thing at about the same time. If you think of the exemplary collections put together by the Habermeyers or the Potter Palmers in the US, or in France by Pellerin's exceptional compatriot, Count Isaac de Camondo, who was one of the few who was buying heavily. It's in France. It's not, of course, altogether adventurous to be buying Impressionist paintings, even by living Impressionists in the 1880s and 90s. What really sets Pellerin apart, however, is his evolving taste for the difficult picture, a taste that led him not only to acquire paintings and drawings by such painters as Renoir, Degas, Monet, Thiebaud, Belmoiso, Sisley, and Manet well before 1900, but to acquire a surprising number of very surprising pictures. He seems to have been particularly interested in Impressionist figure painting, rather than the appealing landscapes that attracted many of his fellow enthusiasts. His Renoirs, for example, included Bather with a Terrier, which is an 1870 painting now in Sao Paulo. And I would say that this is one of the most peculiar of Renoir's nudes. You may probably remember her from the Origin of Impressionism show. It's a painting that seems to combine his recollections or his observations of classical sculpture with his admiration for Courbet, the way that tree grows out of the bank, the figure, just where she is a little hard to tell, on the bank, behind the clothing obviously removed. That is very much like the very controversial Courbet Demoiselle on the Young Ladies on the Edge of the Seine, which was a painting that was roundly denounced. They are not young ladies, they are clearly prostitutes, the local press said. And then this bizarre dog down at the bottom. It is not a typical Renoir. And then the other Renoir he owned, and that, by the way, believe it or not, is the painting hanging behind him in the portraits. Someone could do a whole article about how Matisse transformed this painting in the portraits. This is a portrait, it's called Portrait of Rafa, painted in 1871, now in a private collection. And that is perhaps a more typical Impressionist painting of the period, with its Japanese elements of the standing, clothed, full-length figure. Reminds you his relatives in the work of Manet, and the work of Monet, and even Whistler. But it's also an atypical Renoir in that it's much more roughly painted, less delicately stroked. It's much more dense and vigorous in terms of its paint handling than typical Renoir, even of the period. And the whole composition of that pleated cream-colored dress and the bird cage, and the potted plants and the trellised wallpaper is more unstable and angular and less harmonious than the more rhythmically structured works that we expect of Renoir in the period. His Sicily was a pretty conventional painting. That's now in the Musée d'Orsay, view of floodwaters. But he had the most extraordinary group of Manets, including the very remarkable, I apologize for that dreadful slide, which is fading, the luncheon in the studio, this strange painting that seems to conflate Vermeer and the Spanish artists, this strange compressed space in which the young man, who is either Manet's son or stepson, depending on which version you read, stands as this very peculiar event. What is going on? The figures who each are in their own individual space. Why are the men wearing their hats if they're in a domestic interior? This combination of still life, studio setup, one of the most absorbing paintings of these early years, and one that Michael Fried has written at great length about in his recent book because of the way, what he calls facingness and strikingness, the way everything reveals itself, including the artifice of opposing to the viewer. It's, I think you might even be able to make a case for Pellerin's choosing this Manet as an explanation for why he chose this version of himself by Matisse. The frontality, the way everything presses forward, this demanding quality of the composition, and these opaque, velvety blacks that are so obvious in both paintings. I'm speculating, of course, but it's interesting that the same eye chose both of these. He also owned Nana, this voluptuous image of 1877, which is now in the Kunsthalle in Hamburg. And it was submitted to the Salon in 1877 and rejected. It's based on Zola's famous character, not as she appears in the novel Nana, which had not yet been written in 1877, but as she figures in an earlier story when the bloom is still on her. Now, it must have been very interesting to be in a place where Rafa, the bather with a terrier, and Nana were all hanging. Three large-scale pictures of standing women, one in her underwear, under the watchful gaze of her protector, the nude bather, whose worldly origins are signaled by her discarded clothing and her fashionable little dog, and Rafa, elegantly clad, hardly innocent, a caged bird contemplating a cage full of birds. Rafa was the mistress of Edmond Maître, who was part of the Impressionist circle. He's the man playing the piano in the Basile, a painting of his friends in his studio. A kind of layabout, hanger-on aesthete who didn't do much of anything but was a friend of the Impressionists. Even if Pellerin didn't know who she was, he certainly would have recognized the signals. Like any sophisticated man of his generation, he could easily have deciphered the implication of Renoir's portrait. Well, there's nothing surprising about a sophisticated rich man at the turn of the century owning a lot of sexy pictures of women. But what is impressive is that even in the context of this aesthetically impressive selection, Pellerin owned yet another extraordinary picture of a young woman. Manet's last masterpiece, The Bars of Folie Bergère, 1881-82. Do you see why I was so interested? It's now in the Coteau Institute, of course. Now, a great deal has been written about this picture's sociological subtext, about the brilliant demi-mondaine who frequented the Folie, which was the most fashionable café-concert of its time, about the availability of the girls who waited at the bars of such spectacles, about the implied transaction beyond the purchase of a drink, enacted by Manet's barmaid and her customer, the man whom you see reflected in the mirror behind her. Well, no doubt that's all true, but what makes the work a key painting in the history of Impressionism, and indeed of modernism itself, is not its subject matter, I would argue, but the dislocated, deliberately irrational reflections and the disorienting structure of this picture, which suggests that Manet's chief concern was not to comment on the social mores of late 19th century Paris, but to probe the mysteries of perception itself, not by rendering faithfully what was seen, but by making the viewer ponder the nature of seeing. Of course, we'll never know whether Pellerin acquired the work because of its nominal subject, a handsome young woman of a particular class, gloriously painted, in an evocative setting that included some dazzling still life passages, or whether he acquired it because of its visual rigor. Obviously, what we've seen in Pellerin's collection suggests that he was anything but immune to highly charged, suggestive subjects, but there's also ample evidence that he responded to material with formal resonance more than he did engaging narrative. His Manets, for example, included this peculiar, disjunctive urban panorama, the Universal Exposition of 1867, painted in 1867 and now in the National Gallery of Oslo. This very unstable picture with a scale that keeps shifting back and forth, not quite related groups of figures, painting that you can find a great deal to say about in relation to Manet's sources, but it's certainly not a comfortable picture, and certainly not with the overt attractiveness of the female portraits that female paintings that we've just seen. And while the presence of a painting like this in the collection is suggestive enough, I would say the most persuasive proof lies in the evolution of the collection. Pellerin eventually disposed of most of his Impressionist pictures, admittedly for a very handsome sum. The Manets alone, sold in 1910 to a triumvirate of important dealers, the most important dealers of the time, Bernheim Jeune, Carcera, and Durand-Ruel, are supposed to have brought £1 million francs. And even if you translate that from 1910 into 1910 terms, that's still a very hefty amount of money. Some Impressionist works remain in the collection, of course, as the Matisse portrait attests, or the Matisse portraits attest. Pellerin still owned at least one of his memoirs as late as 1917. Well, what did the Margarine manufacturer substitute for this carefully assembled collection of extraordinary Impressionist pictures? Toward the end of his life, he acquired works by more modern artists, that is to say, in the 1920s. Rial, Maurice Denis, and Matisse. In addition to the two Matisse portraits, he acquired the Three Sisters of 1917, which unfortunately I don't have a slide of. It was in the retrospective. It's one of the three women squeezed into a narrow space in rather fashionable clothes of the period. Very handsome picture, and another version of it, a triptych, as a triptych, is in the Barnes. The real motive for selling the Manets and the related works, however, was to concentrate almost exclusively on the art of the grittiest and most uningratiating of painters, Cezanne. The Margarine tycoon became the greatest collector of Cezanne's paintings in France, amassing more than 90 works spanning the artist's entire career. And don't worry, I don't have slides of all 90, though we won't be here all night. Thiebaud is Cezanne's, at first from Hohlt, the legendary dealer who organized Cezanne's first one-man exhibition in 1895. In 1903, Pellerin bought 6 of the 9 Cezannes in the sale of Zola's collection, and the following year another 7 paintings through the auspices of the distinguished firm of Bellman Jeanne. By 1912, Pellerin had acquired 29 more works by Cezanne, and he continued to enlarge his holdings with pictures from various periods until 1925, when he bought his last painting by the artist, Large Pine and Red Earth, painting of 1890-95, which is now in the Hermitage Museum of St. Petersburg. Many of the pictures had distinguished provenances. In addition to the group that belonged to Cezanne's boyhood friend Zola, there were others from such perceptive collectors as the celebrated Dr. Gachet, who was Cezanne's friend as well as Van Gogh's. Pictures that had belonged to Gauguin and to Pissarro. But what is perhaps more impressive, Pellerin was the first owner of a great number of the Cezannes he selected. In his memoirs, Hohlt pays tribute to Pellerin's prescience. The dealer recounts that when he first exhibited some of Cezanne's nudes, he says in that pioneering one-man show of 1895, although the records suggest that Pellerin bought his first pictures in 1898, Hohlt says, even those most interested in the exhibition urged him to take the nudes out of the window of his gallery, declaring that the public was not yet ready for them. Reluctantly, Hohlt turned the nudes to the wall, but one visitor, he wrote, turning the paintings around, discovered Leda and the Swan and bought it on the spot. And so the first nude to be sold during the exhibition was acquired by Monsieur Auguste Pellerin. Well, the painting on the right is not Leda and the Swan, but it is one of the Cezanne nudes that Pellerin acquired, and not unrelated to Leda. If anything, is slightly more refined. But unlike, and that gives you an idea that unlike Renoir's Bather with a Terrier, there's nothing conventionally lovely or seductive about Cezanne's female nudes, either in figure type, drawing, or paint handling. So there's obviously nothing ambiguous about Pellerin's response to the picture, as there might have been in his more overtly appealing Renoirs and Manets, their formal excellences notwithstanding. Leda came to have company, however, in Pellerin's collection, which included the painting on the right, known as La Toilette, which is now in the Barnes Foundation, 2 versions of Bathsheba, a nameless reclining nude, and more than half a dozen of the small groups of bathers, among other related images, including a marvelous painting that was in the Philadelphia version of the Cezanne retrospective, a kind of cousin of the Museum of Modern Art standing bather, small figure with outstretched arms, posed in the same setting and wearing the same loincloth. That Pellerin chose these paintings, obviously you have only to look at them to realize that he chose them for different reasons than he'd chosen Renoir's Bathers with a Terrier. And that, I would say, is incontrovertible proof of his changing taste. The importance of the great collection was recognized early on. In the celebrated Cezanne retrospective mounted at the 1907 Salon d'Automne to commemorate the painter's death the previous year, an exhibition that arguably changed the course of modern art by offering a potent example to a younger generation that included Picasso, Braque, and Matisse. Almost half of the 57 works exhibited were identified as coming from the Pellerin collection. Roger Fry, of course, as you know from David Cohen's excellent lecture a couple weeks ago, was one of Pellerin's greatest admirers and included him among the honorary committee of the pivotal exhibition Manet and the Post-Impressionists that he organized at the Grafton Galleries in the winter of 1910-1911. Fry's seminal book on Cezanne, published in 1927, grew out of an unrealized plan to publish a complete series of reproductions of all the Cezannes in Monsieur Pellerin's collection, with an accompanying text by Fry. Of the 55 works illustrated in his book, Fry listed 36 belonging to Pellerin and discussed many of them in detail. There are actually only 35 belonging to Pellerin, but we'll come to that later. And they included this extraordinary painting on the left, the still life with soup tureen, now in the Musée d'Orsay, which used to belong to Pissarro. And uncomfortable, thrusting picture with each of these objects carving out its own kind of space. He owned as well the equally celebrated Still Life with a Basket, 1888-1890, which is also now in the Musée d'Orsay. This is all courtesy of the heirs of Pellerin, his son and daughter, who inherited a good deal of paintings and recently gave them to the nation. That painting used to belong to Paul Alexis, who was a close friend of Zola's. He owned as well the Still Life with Compotier, Fruit and Glass, which used to belong to Gauguin, which is one of the paradigmatic paintings for Roger Fry. And he owned the Black Clock, which of course came from Zola's collection and is the crucial painting for many art historians, the painting where Cezanne first declares himself, where he backs off from the superheated intensity of his early paintings and starts showing us the clear, architectural, cool, disciplined kind of structure that we associate with his mature work. So Fry was quite right when he wrote in the introduction to his book that knowing Pellerin's collection was essential to an understanding of Cezanne's development. In fact, the catalogue of works reads like a curator's wish list for an ideal exhibition. Among the portraits, there were 5 of the painter's Uncle Dominique, his lawyer uncle, who patiently posed for him in the early years. These are both paintings from 1866, executed with a palette knife. The one on the left is Uncle Dominique as a lawyer in the Musée d'Orsay, and the painting on the right, which is actually quite a bit larger than the painting on the left. Slides have such a wonderful way of homogenizing everything. The Metropolitan's man in a cotton cap, of course. As well, the extraordinary, tender painting of Cezanne's artist friend, I believe the correct phrase is physically challenged, Achille Empereur, a very interesting painter. There are also some drawings of this magnificent old master head, which are full of Cezanne's affection for his friend. An extraordinarily sympathetic painting, and a very powerful one. And in the same armchair, the artist's father, for whom he felt much less sympathy, reading a newspaper of a political event that he would never have been caught dead reading, so Cezanne has a little joke there. And Pellerin owned as well the early still life, which is was so much to Cezanne's liking that he included it in the painting of his father on the wall. You see it behind him. So he had both the picture and the picture within the picture. And it goes on. The Metropolitan's extraordinary portrait, one of the most remarkable paintings, I think, in the history of modernism. The Madame Cezanne in a yellow armchair, 1893, 1895, which I would say both sums up everything that Cezanne was capable of as a portrait painter and points to most of Matisse as well. The way this figure in this broadly painted dress tilts under the pressure of the unrelenting gaze of the painter is one of the most, as I said, powerful images in the history of modernism. The containment between those two opposed bits of anecdotal information, the curtain in the fabric that we recognize from many other paintings, with its curving lines, the fireplace with the fireplace tools and the painting mirror above it, a rigid geometry that opposes the curves. That was a painting that was chosen by somebody who knew what he was looking at. He owned as well the Musée d'Orsay's Woman with a Coffee Pot, 1895, another key work, another difficult, uningratiating portrait that becomes more complex the more you look at it. That kind of rhyming of the upright figure and the spoon in the cup is an extraordinary relationship that changes the whole scale of the painting. He owned as well perhaps even more remarkable portrait, but unfortunately I don't have a slide of, the portrait of Gustave Geoffroy, also from 1895, also now in the Musée d'Orsay. That's the one of the seated man at the desk with the wall of books behind him, that again maybe is a kind of precedent for the Matisse portrait. Certainly it's an important work in the evolution of Cubism. Pellerin owns several of Cezanne's self-portraits as well, including one that you may remember from the retrospective in Philadelphia. It was the one that surprised me the most. That very bulky black one with the chin tucked in and the background of cream and rose spots from 1875. It's in a private collection and it can't be photographed for mass reproduction. Now, the presence of such works should alert us to what is really the distinguishing factor of Pellerin's collection. Not its comprehensiveness, but its excellence, and moreover, its excellence of a particular kind. Pellerin owned a good many of Cezanne's most ambitious, most achieved pictures in all periods throughout his career. The great card players of 1890-92, which is now in the Barnes collection, belonged to Pellerin. Again, the Barnes being the Barnes, you can't get a slide of it. He also owned, oh, sorry. One of the most celebrated of all the still lifes, the still life with onions, 1890-94, also now in the d'Orsay, and very important, 1890 Mont Saint-Victoire, also in the collection of the Musée d'Orsay. It's the one with the terrace and the big pine tree on the left, and somebody's got the slide, has had the slide out of the Metropolitan for something like 8 months and hasn't returned it. They're trying to find it, they're still trying. And he owned both of these late masterpieces. The Bathers, the large Bathers that's now in the National Gallery in London, and the large Bathers on the right, which is, of course, in Philadelphia. And of course, are both much larger and have a different size relationship, the one on the right being very much larger than the one on the left, and once again, the slides homogenized. It's a staggering selection of works. And it's as though he never put a foot wrong. These are arguably the culmination of Cezanne's lifelong desire to do Poussin over from nature. And they certainly were not paintings that in their day were immediately accepted as being the masterpieces that we now regard them to be. They fascinated the painters who saw them, but for the non-initiated public, they were certainly not pictures that people wanted to acquire. And in addition to these exemplary signature works, Pellerin owned a large number of quirky, downright eccentric pictures, particularly from Cezanne's early years. And those are paintings which still have a capacity to startle, even to disturb, almost a century after the artist's death. Picture after picture among Pellerin Cezanne's stamps itself out for its edginess, for its uncomfortable space, for its intensity, for its downright strangeness. Not only did the collector respond enthusiastically to the early portraits with their aggressive drawing and their loaded, almost brutal surfaces, the portraits of Achille Empereur and of the artist's father that we saw, but Pellerin seems to have had a boundless appetite for the most passionate, even most forbidding of the early pictures. The slightly clumsy interiors and genre scenes, the supercharged allegories, the unnerving scenes of violence and sexuality, most overtly odd of all of Cezanne's paintings. The number of unlovable, tough, early works in Pellerin's collection cannot be explained simply by his manifest desire to own representative, high-quality works from all stages of the painter's evolution, because he has far more of the early works than the actual development of Cezanne's art requires if you're going to have a balanced selection. Pellerin must have responded to their mystery and their heat. He owned, for example, two versions of The Temptation of St. Anthony. This is the 1871 from the Beulah collection. The other one, of course, is the d'Orsay. He owned both versions of The Kinky Afternoon in Naples, 1875, 1877, which is now in this one is now in the National Gallery of Australia. The other one is in private collection. The other one doesn't have the servant who sort of comes out of Delacroix by way of Anne's. He owned a modern Olympia, also known as the Pasha, one of the more brutal bedroom scenes of the 19th century. And that's, he owned also the Delacroix-inspired The Orgy, which is the big, brightly colored feast scene that was in the origins of Impressionism and also in the retrospective, and which also, because it's in a private collection, cannot be reproduced in slides. Those are both paintings, these are all paintings of the early years, the 1860s and early 1870s. He owned this pastoral idyll, which was in Dr. Gachet's collection. That's the Dr. Gachet in the portrait by Van Gogh, resting his head on his arm and sliding out of the picture. He owned, this is obviously a kind of déjeuner sur l'herbe, but it's certainly an overtly peculiar version of the déjeuner sur l'herbe. For one thing, nobody seems to be having a good time. The scale of the figures is willfully shifted. The woman on the left, if she stood up, would probably be about 4 times the size of that probably self-portrait figure of the artist crouching in the middle. Nobody seems to be connecting with anybody. I mean, it's certainly not my idea of a middle, but that's the title that it has. And he owned as well some, early, less peculiar pictures. He didn't have many landscapes. He didn't have a whole lot. Besides this very early factories. This is from 1868, 1870. The view of the Quai d'Orsay, which is where all the new building is going on in Paris right now, where the Treasury has moved. That is from the view from his first Paris studio, painted about 1872. That's a painting that used to belong to Pissarro, by the way. He owned, just to jump for a moment, this quite wonderful 1882 landscape, and then there was the Mont Saint-Victoire of the 1890s, and then that late one of the pine that's now in Russia. But that's about it. I mean, he concentrated on the figure paintings. And he had, as I say, a taste for rough figure paintings. This is a very early self-portrait, possibly the most early surviving one, 1861. Not an easy picture to like. This painting of his friend and colleague Ballebrec, which has grown on me, but again, it's not an overtly likable painting. Also an late 1860s picture. And as I've said, a large number of these religious, allegorical, and sexually ambiguous paintings of the very early years, such as this Christ in Limbo from 1867. the Autopsy of 1868. Now, these were paintings that did not come bolstered with classy provenances. These are pictures that he bought. He was the first person who wanted them. Nobody else wanted them. The painting, this one did come with a classy provenance. This is Paul Alexis. Remember him? He owned the other painting we looked at. Paul Alexis reading to Zola. This was a painting that Zola owned and was part of that sale. And he owned a painting that's now in the Getty called The Eternal Feminine, which is iconographically extremely challenging. A woman on display in this, Freud could have a very good time with that drapery, and then men from all walks of life. Interesting to see this painting with the Beckmanns downtown. Makes you think Beckmann must have known this picture. I think it's more than likely. Certainly he must have known it in reproduction. So this is only the tip of the iceberg. As I say, he owned 92 paintings by Cezanne when he died. And I think I feel confident I've made my case that they were not casual choices. It is the definitive selection of works, as well as a highly personal selection of works. There was only one disappointment when I started digging and tracking down and checking exactly which were Pellerin's paintings. The picture on the right, which is in Basel, is one of, to my mind, the most extraordinary of the little bathers that Cezanne produced before he finally revved himself up to do the big paintings at the end of his life. It's tiny, you know, they're all, well, it's bigger than my book, but it's still a very tiny book. And it's the painting that, it belonged to another very remarkable collector, an American painter called Egidio Fabri, who lived in Italy, although he was an American, and lived in Paris for a long time, and bought Impressionist paintings, particularly Cezanne, early and often. It never belonged to Pellerin. Roger Fry says that it did. And I think it was wishful thinking on his part too, because it's such a crucial painting. It's obviously a picture that Picasso looked at long and hard. La Demoiselle d'Avignon arguably comes right out of this picture. Think of that figure on the left in Demoiselle d'Avignon and that strange brown drapery, like a tree trunk. The crouching figure, the five figures, the standing figure. It's a painting that Picasso obviously knew because it was in the 1907 exhibition and would have been available for him to study throughout that entire exhibition. It's not the little bathers that Picasso bought. That's still in the Musée Picasso. It's a nice picture, it's a good picture. It's not as good as this one. I suspect he wanted this one, and Egidio Fabri already had it. I don't know what date Picasso bought his, but it would be altogether too neat, I suppose, if Fry had been right and Pellerin had owned this one as well. He had almost all the other really great ones, so I guess we have to allow this one to go to someone else. Thank you.